Wheat markets are back in focus after a sharp move higher, with Kansas wheat hitting limit up yesterday. There's been a lot of back and forth in this market over the past few weeks, and plenty for traders to digest. I'm Johanna Bota, and joining us now to break it all down is Bertrand Oesterle, VP of Clearing and Execution Sales at StoneX. Welcome back, Bert.
Morning, Joanna.
So there is a lot going on, but I do want to start with Kansas wheat because a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about a wave of bullish news. Then last week, we thought that maybe there was a technical correction. So what is causing or what is driving this sharp move higher?
So it's been a cocktail of bullish news for grains and oilseeds over the past week. So if we look at wheat, as you mentioned, technically we were expecting a correction. We had that correction, and interestingly, that correction went to the first level we had mentioned, which was the 50-day moving average. And as soon as we touched that 50-day moving average, we rallied back up.
Right.
So we need to explain why we've rallied, and there's a myriad of reasons. So first of all, the US-Iran lack of understanding means that once again the energy markets are up and they're providing spillover support into grains and oilseeds. But then there are more specific reasons about wheat specifically, and it's been a week of bad news for US wheat. So we had a survey or crop tour in Oklahoma late last week, which put the crop at 47.5 million. Actually 47.8 million tons compared to 94.5 for the 10-year average, so a much smaller crop. This morning we had a northern Kansas crop tour that put the yield estimate at 38.3 bushel per acre. That's down from 50.5 last year. That's down from 47.2 for the 5-year average. So again, it's just much smaller expectation of production. And that came in a way as a surprise because when we look at what came out on Monday, we had some crop conditions that were reported by the USDA for winter wheat that came way worse than we anticipated. So they came in at 28% good to excellent. So if you remember last week, we were 31%. That was 1% better than what was anticipated. We had expectation of beneficial rain. And it feels like those rains have arrived but have missed some of the most affected drought areas. So 28% good to excellent compared to 32% anticipated. It's a very bad rating. So on the back of all this, the market rallied. And especially when we look at the crop conditions in Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma. This was then all put in focus with yesterday's WASDE reports. So the WASDE came in with a crop estimate for wheat in the US at 1.561 billion bushels. That's some 21% less than last year. And the likes of Reuters, Bloomberg were very quick to put headlines out to compare this to previous years, saying that the overall crop is the lowest since 1972. And when we look at hard red wheat in particular, it's the lowest crop since 1957. So this made the market rally. Kansas went limit up, Chicago went limit up. Kansas actually settled limit up, and Chicago was a touch off limit up. And this morning we've got Chicago a touch down, Kansas is still a touch up. So it's going to be interesting to see if the US this afternoon come in and push this rally further, or if we take a breather. Now, when we look at this US situation, it obviously fed into lower worldwide figures. And the USDA also confirmed what we had been speaking about some 2 weeks ago, in the sense that in countries like Canada, Australia, Argentina, Kazakhstan, for example, last year we had large to almost record crops, and this year we're expecting a return to so-called normal crops. So less production as well. So when we look at the world stocks, it's 275 million tons compared to estimations of 280.8, and it's down from 279.2 last year. So again, it's a reduction, and that was the element that really got wheat going yesterday.
Understandable. Okay, last week we were challenging this correction, so let's do the same thing for this week. What could derail the rally?
So there's a few elements that could derail the rally, and it's going to be about how traders assess the situation now. Are they going to just focus on the fact that that's it, we know what's going on in the US, what's next? Or is demand going to panic a bit and come to the forefront.
Yeah.
So demand for me is the first element. Our US colleagues yesterday were saying that with the big USDA figures from yesterday, the big move, maybe the Asian buyers will panic a little bit. But we've seen, for example, some tenders being put out this morning from South Korea and then they passed. So that means that maybe prices are already a bit too high for consumption. And the other bit of consumption which the market will focus on is the argument we had last week, which is basically saying that the whole of North Africa and some of the Middle East may not import as much. So again, to put it into details, the Moroccans are expecting to have a crop that's twice as much as last year, the Tunisians some 20% more than last year. The Algerians a better crop, although they still have been tendering recently. The Egyptians have already procured some 2.3 million tons of wheat domestically for stocks. We heard, as we mentioned before, that the Turks may reduce or restrict imports from June. And we also heard this week on top of it that Syria is likely to have a very much bigger, larger crop. So in that context, it's going to be interesting to see if we focus on what we've just known got confirmed yesterday, or if we're going to shift back to demand, and if that demand is not there, it could provide a bit of a correction. Then also the Russians are still very present on the market. So we've been mentioning over the past few weeks, from January all the way to now, their exports are much bigger than last year. For May, the estimates we've seen from Sovecon, ICAR, Rusagro-Trans are all in the range of 2.5 to 3 million tons. And that is above what we achieved last year of 2.1. So Russia is still expected to be very present. And then in Europe, the bullish element of last week has disappeared. So we were mentioning that it was a bit dry in some areas of Western Europe. It could impact the flowering process. It has rained since, and we were in Hamburg for the grains and oilseed bourse last week. So we met with some of the French, German, Dutch, Poles and Baltic participants. And the Western Europeans are all saying that they think that this story of flowering issues because of dryness is over. It's rained adequately, but it's still potentially a concern for part of Poland and the Baltic region because it's still a bit dry, but they're saying that if it rains, it should be okay. So overall, Europe is still expected to have a nice crop. And then Europe has got a situation as well. If you remember, we spoke about the all crop expiry in the past. So May has gone out of the board. It came out of the board without any delivery. So the impression is that the old crop stocks are going to be carried over to the new crop stock. And therefore, it may put pressure on September, especially when September gets to harvest. So opinions have been quite interesting over SEPDEC. SEPDEC is already pretty low. It's minus 975. And people are, in a sense, saying if this rally, if it continues this afternoon in the US, and if the Trump-Xi meeting provides some more bullishness, then that SEPDEC could rally a bit. If it rallied to -8, -6, someone in the trade would look to sell it. And then once it all abates, then the funds who are very long will need to roll that September into selling that SEPDEC, and the trade would look to buy back and potentially position themselves in the depth on the GTC basis to secure a Q placement. So it's going to be an interesting spread to watch because there's already opinions in the market on how to trade that spread. And finally, the bit that could derail the rally is the technicals. If we look at today, December Chicago wheat yesterday touched the upper Bollinger Band, it touched the overbought RSI, and it's slightly correcting today. It's very difficult at this stage to assess what the US are going to do this afternoon, but the technical element could play on a regular basis, despite the fact that some are saying that with the amount of bullish news we've seen, the RSI could go well overboard into the 80%. And if we did, I think a lot of people would look at producer accumulators to take advantage of that situation.
Right. So obviously a lot to unpack in wheat. What about corn? Also a mixture of geopolitics and WASDE report?
It's been the same in a way. So obviously the first point is the Iran-US war, which is not abating. So the fact that the US have not come to an agreement with Iran, Iran came back saying that basically the US demands are just too excessive. Trump said their answer is totally unacceptable. So we're still in the same situation. And for corn and for soybean, the focus from the trade is to say, we need to be much more careful here because the Strait of Hormuz is still shut. There's more and more energy people saying that in the next few months, we might have to have restrictions on conventional fuels. Therefore, the shift to demand in alternative fuels, such as ethanol, is something that's going to have to be watched and may become much more in focus.
Of course.
So we have our barometer. That barometer is the EIA figures that we get every Wednesday. Last Wednesday it was 26 million barrels of US ethanol stocks. Again, that's a high figure. It's not as high as the 27.3 record we've seen a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
But compared to normally where we are at this stage of the year with 23 and a half, we're much higher. It's an indication of higher demand. Then when we look at the USDA data we had this week, so the USDA confirmed that the US crop is 57% planted, down from 59% last year, but it's above the 5-year average of 52%. So in that sense, planting is going well. But the USDA came in yesterday with a WASDE report that showed a production which, similarly to what we mentioned in wheat, is not as large as last year. It's going to be a big crop, but not a record crop like last year.
A normal
last year, 17 billion bushels. This year, just under 16 billion bushels. We're talking 15.995 billion bushels.
Yeah.
So in that sense, a little bit tighter.
Yeah.
And then we need to put this in context in terms of the China-Trump meeting. It could produce more demand for corn. There's a delegation from the US and from China and South Korea. They're preparing a farm deal that Trump and Xi could
decide on this week. Yeah?
Exactly. And so it puts the potential buying of Chinese from China of US corn and USDDG again in focus. At this stage, the US exports are 3% above the rate that they need to be to get to the USDA data, annual figure. So it does help in that sense.
Yeah.
Now, when we look also at the figures in terms of stocks, the stocks in the US are still, according to the USDA, for the year ahead, abundant. So they're 1.957 billion bushels. That's down from 2.142 last year. And that figure, although it's lower, it's still decent because the year 22, 23, 23, 24, 24, 25 were much lower.
Yeah.
So it's lower, a lower stock, but still a decent stock.
Yeah.
When we look at the amount of ethanol which is expected to be consumed, plus the potential on export because of Trump and Xi today, that's where that element of support was yesterday. And on top, we had spillover support from wheat into corn.
Of course. Okay. So, I mean, you can tell me or we can skip it, but is there anything new on South American corn?
So there was some interesting data in that report as well. So the Argentine data was updated by the WASDE report as well. So they put the crop at 57 million tons, up from 52. Actually, it's 59 against 52. So they've increased it by 7 million tons. It's quite a big correction. But it's more in line with the 61, 67 we've seen from private analysts, which would be a record. And for Brazil, they put the crop at 135 million tons, which is more or less in the mid-range of 130 to 140 we've seen. And over the past week, we've seen more people going towards the 140 mark.
Okay, so we've talked about corn, energy, WASDE support. I want to talk about soybean because obviously with the President Trump and President Xi meeting, that's going to be a big discussion. So is it the same story for soybeans?
Absolutely. So first of all, the increase in energy has spilled over into the soybean complex just because of the biodiesel connection. So soybean oil have gone up. It is again on the back of the lack of understanding between the US and the Iranians on their potential peace deal. And on top of that, we had some news out of the USDA this week on Monday and yesterday. So on Monday, the USDA came out to say that the crop is 49% planted so far. It's well above the 5-year average of 36%. There's still a lot of people in the market who say it gets to confirm what we've been expecting for quite some time, a larger area in the US, therefore a larger crop. And that larger crop was seen in the report yesterday with 120.7 million tons, which is up 4.7 million tons from last year. So a larger crop, but still seen as bullish overall. Why? Because we've got that feed from the energy market into our markets. And also there's large expectation of two elements which we've mentioned before, which is the biodiesel demand. So we still have expectation, especially from US participants, that it is not abating, it's remaining very strong. So we've seen it into the NOPA figures, we've seen into the USDA crush figures, and we've seen it yesterday again in this USDA report, WASDE report, where the biofuel is some 120 million bushels more than it was last year. So again, a consolidation of that opinion that biodiesel is going to be very strong in the US. And on the export side, it's back to this Trump-Xi meeting where the expectation is for Trump to get his way with Xi and for Xi to commit to more buying from China of US soybean origin. But some feel that maybe it's not going to be any better than last October.
Okay, well, let's delve a little deeper into the meeting. Obviously, the meeting is happening over the next few days. I think President Trump has arrived or is on his way to China as we speak. This has been a meeting that was already postponed once, maybe because he was trying to see if the Iran conflict would work itself out, but it hasn't. So here we are. He has to do the meeting. What can we expect?
So the expectation from the US side is huge. So the exports from the US are 3% below what they need to be to get to the annual figure from the USDA. That figure is a lot better than a month ago, where it was -7%, -9%, so they've caught up a bit. But the expectation is if China comes in higher than last October, then suddenly the US might catch up on their export potential.
Okay.
But when we look at China, China doesn't really need to make any concession to the US in the sense that they've got large imports so far and they've got availability between the US or Brazil.
Yeah.
So if China decided to buy more, it would be purely a political element to appease Trump. And when we look at the figures about how much China has imported and how much Brazil is doing, the Chinese for April have confirmed a import figure of 8.48 million tons compared to 4.02 the previous month. And that's 40% more than last year at the same time. And when we look at the imports for the 2026 year so far, they're 25.2 million tons compared to 23.2. That's 2 million tons more. So they're already ahead in terms of imports. And when we look at Brazil, Brazil has almost finished harvesting its 180 million ton crop. The Brazilian customs have confirmed that the April exports were huge, 16.75 million tons. And for May, we're expecting 14 to 16 million tons of export. So in a way, China can simply play both cards. They have everything in front of them at their hand, basically.
Okay, so we will have a long conversation about that next week once we know more from the outcome in the meeting. Okay, finally, anything interesting or noteworthy in rapeseed?
So rapeseed's been interesting as well. So obviously it's part of the oilseed complex. As the energy spilled over into soybean, it spilled over into rapeseed. So some people were like, well, is rapeseed too expensive? Should we do something on rapeseed or should we wait? And when we look at the spec position, it's a large spec position. It's 60,000 lots long. And we'll get an update today at 4 o'clock.
Okay.
So there's been a lot of discussion in the trade to see how they could potentially put that long spec position to their advantage, and that's been a discussion about the spread of August NOV. So August NOV is trading between -5, -2 recently. As I walked in, was -325, and the feeling is that with all this bullish news, and if there is a Xi-Trump decision for China to buy more US soybeans, maybe the entire oilseed complex could rally, and that spread could rally close to parity or go to parity or into inverse. And if it did, the trade is saying would be a selling opportunity for them in their mind. And if they did, once everything calms down and once the specs need to roll that position, they would need to sell the August, and therefore they would look to buy back that August NOV and placing themselves in the queue on a GTC basis to secure queue placement. So that's quite an interesting opinion on the August NOV from those trade members. But we had some German participants also warning us, saying, don't forget the May-August spread, which was very much in inverse, went very deeply in inverse for the delivery, and it did hurt quite a few people. So a reminder that you might have an opinion, but it might be a tricky one if it goes against you.
Of course.
And the last bit I would mention about rapeseed, again, we were in Hamburg last week, so we did ask everyone what they thought of their rapeseed fields. The Germans, the Dutch, the French were saying that it's rain on a regular basis, it's looking good. But the polls showed us some pictures of fields that were a bit more, drier and a bit patchy. So the Baltic people and the Polish participants were saying that they need more rain.
Bert, thank you so much. That was a lot of information, and I'm impressed with all the numbers that you can keep in your head. So thank you again for all your insights, and thank you for watching. For more financial content, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.